What if I told you that a single narrow waterway, just 20-1 miles wide at its tightest point, could determine the stability of the global economy? Not in theory, but in real time, because somewhere off the southern coast of Iran, in the shadow of one of the most heavily monitored maritime corridors on Earth, a message was transmitted that immediately escalated tensions across multiple military command centers. For words, you will experience hell. It was delivered in a private negotiation room. It was buried inside diplomatic language. It was broadcast publicly by elements linked to Iran's naval military structure. And it was aimed directly at American forces scattered across the Middle East. Within hours, American aircraft were already conducting precision strikes against coastal surveillance infrastructure in southern Iran. Radar sites, monitoring stations, systems designed not just for defense but for tracking movement through one of the most strategically sensitive waterways on the planet, the Strait of Hormuz, a passage through which a significant portion of global oil shipments flows every single day. But this crisis is no longer just about oil. It is about visibility, control, and the invisible systems that hold the modern economy together. Because beneath the surface of that strait lies something even more critical than shipping lanes. A network of undersea communication cables, fiber optic lines laid across the seabed, connecting financial hubs across Asia, Europe, and the Gulf. These are not military assets. They are economic arteries, and they carry the digital backbone of global commerce banking systems, shipping insurance confirmations, cross-border settlements, and real-time financial transactions that allow trillions of dollars to move every day. Not hypothetically, daily. In this emerging strategic environment, control over physical maritime choke points is no longer sufficient. Control over data flow has become equally decisive, which is why recent Iranian military messaging has shifted tone, not toward conventional naval threats, but toward infrastructure-based leverage. Signals from Iranian military-linked channels have suggested that access, regulation, or even disruption of underwater systems could become part of a broader pressure strategy. In strategic terms, this represents a fundamental evolution, from controlling ships to influencing the systems that allow ships to operate. And that shift is what triggered alarm inside multiple Western defense planning circles, because unlike oil tankers, these systems cannot be rerouted easily. They sit fixed on the seabed, exposed, and largely dependent on continuous protection rather than mobility. At the same time, American forces have intensified maritime surveillance across the region, not just surface patrols, but layered detection networks designed to map underwater activity in one of the most acoustically complex environments on Earth. The Strait of Hormuz is not an easy battlefield. It is shallow, noisy, and saturated with commercial traffic. Hundreds of vessels pass through it daily, each one generating acoustic interference, each one masking potential military movement beneath the surface. This creates a paradox. The more strategically important the region becomes, the harder it becomes to monitor. And this is where the operational dimension begins to shift from economics to military reality. Iran's naval doctrine in this region has long emphasized asymmetric capability. Small, fast, low-profile platforms designed for shallow water environments. Systems that do not compete directly with large naval fleets, but instead exploit complexity, congestion, and environmental noise. In a narrow waterway like the Strait of Hormuz, that becomes a critical advantage, because detection is not just a matter of technology. It is a matter of interpretation. Distinguishing threat from background is the hardest problem modern naval warfare faces in this environment. And that uncertainty is exactly what makes the current escalation so unstable. Because once surveillance infrastructure becomes contested, every vessel becomes a potential signal, every movement becomes a possible test, and every incident carries the risk of miscalculation, which brings us back to the strike phase that triggered this latest escalation cycle. American air assets conducted targeted operations against coastal installations in southern Iran, focusing on radar monitoring infrastructure linked to maritime awareness systems. From a purely tactical perspective, these are not high-value strategic targets in isolation, but in a maritime choke point, they function as early warning layers. Removing or degrading them changes the entire perception of control. And perception, in this environment, is as important as physical capability. Iran's response was immediate in tone, but measured in execution. Warnings escalated through naval communication channels. Statements framed the strikes not as isolated incidents, but as interference with sovereign control over one of the world's most critical maritime passages. And then came the language that changed the strategic temperature of the entire region. A public warning that American bases in the region would face consequences described in deliberately absolute terms. Not limited retaliation, not proportional response, but something framed as sustained and severe escalation. At that moment, the crisis stopped being about isolated exchanges. It became a layered system of deterrence failure, surface strikes, maritime threats, infrastructure vulnerability, and political messaging aimed at both domestic and international audiences simultaneously. And underneath all of it, a single question began to dominate military analysis. Not whether escalation would continue, but whether it could still be controlled at all. Because every modern conflict has a threshold, a point where signaling stops working, and action begins speaking louder than intent. And in the Strait of Hormuz, that threshold is dangerously close to being reached. Once a crisis reaches the point where both sides begin responding in real time instead of planning ahead, the battlefield stops being geographical. It becomes psychological. And in the hours following the initial exchange in the Strait of Hormuz, that shift became impossible to ignore. Iranian Naval Command channels broadcast a warning that immediately circulated through regional monitoring systems. Full words, "You will experience hell." But this was not a standalone statement. It came immediately after confirmed American strikes on coastal radar and surveillance infrastructure in southern Iran. Facilities designed to monitor maritime movement through one of the most sensitive choke points in global energy logistics. From Tehran's perspective, this was not just tactical interference. It was a challenge to visibility itself. Because in modern maritime warfare, the side that sees first often dictates the tempo of escalation. And once that advantage is disrupted, deterrence begins to erode. Fast. The response did not remain at the rhetorical level. Within hours, reports of missile and drone activity began to emerge across multiple Gulf monitoring channels. Air defense systems in Bahrain and Kuwait were activated. Radar networks tracked inbound objects over maritime corridors. Sirens echoed through installations that host American personnel. And suddenly, what had been a localized maritime confrontation expanded into a multi-node regional alert condition. At this stage, escalation no longer follows a linear path. It becomes distributed. Different actors respond to different fragments of the same crisis. The coordination becomes harder to maintain than action itself. What makes this phase particularly unstable is the presence of overlapping legal and diplomatic frameworks. On paper, a memorandum of understanding still exists between Washington and Tehran, a fragile construct intended to create space for negotiations. But in practice, that framework is being eroded in real time by operational reality. Each strike creates justification for retaliation. Each retaliation creates justification for further strikes. And each cycle reduces the political space available for D-escalation. This is the escalation loop. And once it begins, it is extremely difficult to interrupt without a clear external shock or decisive political intervention. Inside Washington, the response mechanism is split across multiple layers. Military planners focus on containment. Political leadership focuses on signaling. And strategic communications attempt to maintain the perception that escalation remains controlled. But control in this environment is increasingly conditional. Because the battlefield is no longer confined to military bases or naval corridors, it now includes commercial shipping routes, financial infrastructure, and the perception of global economic stability. The Strait of Hormuz remains the central node in this system, not because of its size, but because of its function. A narrow corridor through which a significant percentage of global energy flows, and where even minor disruptions can produce disproportionate global economic reactions. Oil markets respond within minutes. Insurance premiums adjust within hours, and shipping routes are recalculated in real time. This is what transforms regional conflict into global instability. Not scale, but connectivity. Meanwhile, Iran's strategic calculus appears to be driven by a combination of external pressure and internal constraint. Years of economic sanctions have reduced strategic flexibility. Domestic economic stress has increased political sensitivity to perceived weakness. The military doctrine within the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has long emphasized asymmetric deterrence over conventional parity. In this context, escalation is not necessarily irrational. It is structured. A method of generating leverage when conventional negotiation channels are exhausted or stalled. But structured escalation still carries risk, because it depends on the assumption that the opposing side will respond within predictable bounds, and that assumption is no longer guaranteed. On the American side, the response posture reflects a different constraint. Military superiority is not in question, but escalation management is, because the cost of uncontrolled expansion in this theater would extend far beyond the region itself. It would affect global energy markets, allied stability, and domestic political calculations. This is why responses tend to remain calibrated. Targeted strikes, limited engagements, messaging designed to reinforce deterrence without triggering full scale expansion. But calibration only works when both sides share an understanding of limits. And that shared understanding is beginning to fracture. As each side tests boundaries, those boundaries shift. And once they shift enough, they stop functioning as constraints. They become reference points for further escalation. At the same time, regional actors are no longer passive observers. Gulf states are actively reinforcing air defense systems. Maritime organizations are adjusting shipping advisories. And international diplomatic channels are attempting to reopen communication pathways before further escalation occurs. But diplomacy in this phase is reactive. It follows events rather than shaping them, which means it is always slightly behind the operational reality. And that delay is enough to create strategic risk. Because in a system moving this quickly, timing becomes decisive. Not intent, not capability. Timing. Back in the Strait of Hormuz, naval and aerial assets continue to operate in close proximity. Detection systems are active. Patrol patterns overlap. And every new movement is interpreted through the lens of the most recent escalation. This creates a feedback loop where perception and reality reinforce each other. And once that loop stabilizes, even temporarily, it becomes the new baseline for conflict behavior. What happens next depends on whether either side chooses to break that loop deliberately, or whether it continues to accelerate under its own momentum. And that is the central uncertainty at this stage of the crisis. Not who is escalation dominance, but whether escalation itself can still be controlled. Because as history shows that once regional conflicts reach this level of interconnected pressure, they rarely resolve through negotiation alone. They either stabilize through exhaustion, or expand until a new equilibrium is forced into existence. And right now, neither outcome is visible on the horizon. Only motion. Faster than diplomacy. Faster than verification. Faster than decision minus making itself. And that is what makes this moment so strategically unstable. Not the missiles, not the rhetoric, but the speed at which the system is now responding to itself.